BeOne was the opposite. They built the company from day one to truly be a global company operating in 5 continents.
BeOne is doing an incredible number of things, reinventing the model around bringing medicines to market. But one big key component about how these drugs get commercialized.
That type of idea of company is very different, especially in the biopharma industry.
Anand's current role is all things direct-to-consumer innovation and digital health over at BeOne Medicines. Anand has spent a huge part of his life helping with clinical advocacy, research, specifically in the area of HIV, global health policy.
I think what AI now has transcended is we now have the ability to take very complex information and simplify it and allow every single patient to be a CEO of their disease.
Welcome to Kinara Unfiltered with Anand and Chase. I might have to bring you on as a co-host. We do like virtual panels. We kind of tag team some of this with other executives in the industry.
I think there could be some great chemistry. And I have to tell you this, when I was in medical school, I worked with this dermatologist. I was really interested in dermatology.
No, hold on. I want that in the podcast. So hold on one second. I want that in the podcast.
Yeah.
So before we jump in, I'm going to quickly introduce Anand. This is the one thing I'll do. I'll introduce Anand, and then we're just going to free flow. We're going to hear stories. Anand's going to tell jokes.
Gotta hear the jokes.
The goal is to have fun. So first of all, who is Anand? So Anand is a physician. He went to medical school. He received his degree. Anand has spent a huge part of his life really helping with clinical advocacy, research, specifically in the area of HIV, global health policy. Anand's current role is he's running all things direct-to-consumer innovation and digital health over at BeOne Medicines, as well as reporting directly into John Euler. Is that right? John is an incredible founder, entrepreneur, and obviously a brilliant leader within bio, but really has a deep understanding of technology as well. Anand and I met when he was at Gilead. And Anand has always been one of those individuals who has the ability to see the future before many in life sciences have acknowledged the future that's come. So I'm, again, really excited about this conversation. Anand, I'm not even going to tell the story. Do you want to tell everybody, how did we meet? And what was your first impression when we met in Manhattan Beach when you were still at Gilead?
I vividly remember it. And, thanks for the gracious introduction. And I think everything you said, I could say about you, Chase, and Ahmed as well. I think the story is actually quite fitting. At the time at Gilead, we were setting up essentially a direct-to-patient portal to engage individuals at risk for HIV. And through this process, we were working with a number of consultants. We were trying to get into the ecosystem, which I think, as Chase will agree to, was quite embryonic at that time. I think certainly there were some direct-to-health startups that were starting to get traction, but nobody was really thinking about how can biopharma tap into the direct-to-patient vertical. And I think today, in some ways, now we're just amazed at all of these great companies like Lilly and Novo doing it. But at the time in 2019, everybody was sort of thinking of it as a black box. Everybody knew the potential, but I think we were sort of confronting things like business compliance and the viability of the model, and how do you build a white label system to sort of promote that. And at the time, we had, through, I think, the Boston Consulting Group, which I know is near and dear to Chase because his older brother was a consultant there, got to know, and
still
at the
is.
time,
He still is. If you're listening, Jared, he still is a consultant at the Boston Consulting Group.
And Chase is a great little brother, and he's always raving about his older brother. And I know that because I've talked to him late at night about you. But you'll have to remind me the name of the company. I can't quite remember. It's not Ostro. It wasn't Arcs Defined. What did we call it then?
At the
2019.
time, we were Arcs Defined. We were Arcs
Defined,
yeah.
Right? And so the Boston Consulting Group has an innovation laboratory, this beautiful space in Manhattan Beach. At the time, it was let's meet Chase and Ahmed, and fly down LAX. Chase and Ahmed being two roll up your sleeve entrepreneurs. Let's pick up Anand and take him to this meeting, and we'll chat. Okay, and that's what every entrepreneur does. And by the way, this is what John Euler did and John Euler. You were very gracious there, Chase. Five successful companies and five successful exits across many different industries. But he has that sort of entrepreneur's imperative that you and Ahmed have, which is it doesn't matter if you know something or don't know something. You're intensely curious to find out the answer. And the way to find out that answer is to tap into these networks. And even if you don't have somebody in your network, you forge a new relationship. And whether that new relationship leads to a business relationship a month, 3 months, 5 years, 6 years from now, the shared vision of how to ideate on ideas and build that sort of network of ideation is huge. That social network that every single entrepreneur needs. And the other recipe to do that is to be everywhere and anywhere. And I know John would always tell me that, he'd find out that there was some big investor who would have a couple of hours in a city, and he would tell them, hey, I'm in that city. If he, of course, was not in the city, he'd jump on United Airlines, he'd get to that city, he'd create this serendipity, and then, have a very meaningful connection. And, I think we had that same connection. Ahmed and Chase picked me up. I was very impressed. Ahmed, I think at the time must have been in his mid 20s, maybe, and he was driving this Mercedes with these lights. I felt like I was on a Virgin Atlantic flight. It was that just so memorable. And, Chase, for the audience, you guys know how incredible Chase is at the art of conversation and a consummate storyteller, right? And when you think about that entrepreneurial imperative, the entrepreneurs that are purely transactional, we have a product, you have money, or we have something and you invest, they're not the ones that really ever succeed. You have to build this connection, and Chase does that. I think all of the viewers know this. He has this amazing life experience that's at the intersection of medicine and science and technology. He's a polymath. I think I've never met somebody like yourself, Chase, who's so well read across so many different disciplines. And this conversation, while we're sort of permutating, this is how we would think about a direct to patient solution for individuals at risk for HIV, but was sort of emblematic of what we have to do in healthcare, which is we have to connect the dots. No disease is in isolation. It's determined by a unique set of determinants, economic, health, society. And that's the beauty of technology and the beauty of health tech, because despite all of these structural impediments, at the end of the day, you're engineers, and all you're seeing is here's a problem, here's a solution, what's the shortest path to solution, and then let's test it. And when you really think about things that are so structurally entrenched, such as the problems we face in healthcare and the intersection between the economics of healthcare and the delivery of healthcare, and then against the backdrop of things about the inequities in healthcare and the social determinants of health and the access barriers. That's why I love health tech entrepreneurs like yourself, because at the end of the day, one could get lost in all of that and be so hopeless and just stuck in inertia. But instead, you're turning on your engineering hat that you had at Parsable, and you're just saying, here's a problem, here's a solution, here's 5 different short paths. Let's figure out how to make this thing as easier as possible, get something out there, and then iterate. And that personifies all of the great technology and all the great companies you've built, including Ostro. And, that's, I think, the inspiration for all of us that, don't focus on all the reasons why not, focus on all the reasons as to how to do it.
Well, first of all, Nan, I've never gotten this on the podcast before. So thank you. You're making me sound a lot better than I am, but no, in all seriousness, I appreciate it. I'm never going to forget it. I love the fact that you even remember the lights in Ahmed's car, because I actually had the visual in my mind as we were driving down with the changing lights on literally the side doors, if you can recall. But you hit on a couple of very important topics, and I want to go deeper into one, right? Which is this concept that innovators don't often get the answer right the first time. It's really, you can have a path to many different failures in order to find your success. And we see that typically within all aspects of everything from entrepreneurs building software companies, entrepreneurs starting biotech companies. I know the term tends to be many shots on goal within biotech. Really, where do you see and how do you think about what separates the most successful entrepreneurs that are starting really the most important companies within biotech today versus those that don't succeed? What do you think is the difference between those two entrepreneurial types, given the exposure you've had both at large and smaller, and now, of course, very fast growing, well established company like BeOne Medicines in the oncology space?
I think it's obviously a very complicated answer, but I think, the sort of the founder mantra, this tenacity of just never stopping and always asking questions and always trying to figure out solutions and starting something and pivoting. And I think that's a skill set that you can't quite frankly learn in an academic setting. You really just have to be wired that way. And I think the other piece of it is to fail fast. And, when I think about the two great biopharma entrepreneurs that I've had the privilege to get to know, I think about, John Martin, who, of course, was the iconic CEO of Gilead that gave rise to essentially these life-saving treatments for HIV. He recapitulated that same playbook for hepatitis C. And it was, in his mantra, I think, in his sort of secret sauce, if you will, was the idea that it all tracks back to the molecule. And, chemistry, like many disciplines in science, has a very sort of rational design. And in many ways, if you can really just understand the molecule and you can understand the virus that you're targeting and how it binds, it's as simple as that. And, when you think about that paradigm and you think about what Gilead has been able to do, obviously with its roots in HIV, then extended to hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and then eventually COVID-19, all of that was sort of John Martin's medicinal chemistry mind. I've got a virus, I've got a small molecule. This is how I inhibit it. This is how I get to virological suppression. And that model and that framework, and it sort of shows you all of these different leaders come to leadership from many different pathways, but their fundamental foundational model of asking and answering a question, whether you're a great entrepreneur, MBA type like John Euler, or a great medicinal chemist like John Martin, or a great physician scientist like Chase Feiger, you all bring that framework in mind, and it's a tried and tested framework. It's not a framework per se for business. It's a tried and tested framework for how you approach problems, personal or business, and the tenacity that you then use to iterate. It's essentially, the very concept of like an AI engine, right? You've got these inputs, the foundational learning model, and then it's constantly just iterating and getting smarter and smarter and smarter. And then the tenacity, the grit, I think we've all read, a great University of Pennsylvania professor, Angela Duckworth. You have to have that. You can't just give up. You have to have some focus in some ways, but then the ability to go where the innovation or the business model takes you. And that's where, when I think about the other great mentor in my life, John Euler, he's a serial entrepreneur. In some ways, it's interesting because he's, trained as a engineer, economist, serial entrepreneur, got an MBA, got his sort of chops helping advise companies at McKinsey. But in some ways, very similar to John Martin, had a vision, unencumbered by the orthodoxy of how things are done in the industry, in this case, biopharma, and questioned everything. And I think that's the other common denominator. You have to question everything, even the things that you think are foundational, because it's usually in the pursuit of asking that question that you suddenly think, oh, maybe it's slightly different. And if it's slightly different, maybe there's a way to do that with a competitive advantage and find a real piece of value, in this case, in our industry for patients, and then build a model around it. And I think, probably when I think about all of the people you've interviewed over the years, whether it's through Forbes or Kinara, probably, if you'd agree, that's the common denominator. It's that sort of monastic focus, rational inquiry, and then go. And sort of acknowledge you're never going to get it perfect, but as long as you have the ability to pivot as you ingest new information and experiment, somehow you get to a scalable model that is going to become sustainable and quite successful.
And I want to shift this back now to BeOne in particular, go a little bit deeper there, because BeOne Medicines is a very special company, right? It definitely a very unique operating model with obviously a focus on cutting edge cancer treatments. But the model is interesting in how integrated it is. And we talked a lot about this, Anand, but where do you think the innovation came with the business model and approach? And how do you think John arrived at the decision to structure BeOne Medicines in the way that it is structured? And I want you to talk a little bit more about how that's different relative to many other pharma companies.
Incredible story. And, in this case, John Euler, who had, a lot of professional exposure all over the globe, sort of recognized in and around 2010 or so, and the previous company that he had was essentially a clinical research organization. He sort of recognized that the inherent challenges in drug development to meet global access stymied the industry. You would see innovation at that time that would predominantly come out of industry, and it would mainly just go to what were essentially considered the for-profit markets: the United States, Europe, Japan, a few other emerging markets, 1/6 of the global population. But the burden of disease, and obviously cancer is a highly prevalent disease. This is evident, but this is frankly evident in a lot of highly prevalent diseases. The burden of disease is 4/6 of the world's population. And that is to say, populations that have the disease, they have some basal system of healthcare, but oftentimes what's neglected in getting the innovation from 1/6 to 4/6 of the world is the cost model. And when you look at the costs of drug discovery, it's really concentrated in those clinical development years when you're advancing from phase 1 through phase 3. And the predominant cost driver of that is clinical trials. And he basically recognized in 2010 that if you truly wanted to change that quotient for clinical trials, you have to get out of just doing trials in the United States and Europe in very expensive clinical trial sites, and do it in places where you don't have as high volume, but you have access to great physicians, great healthcare, and obviously patients in need. And so he recognized that if you wanted to do that, you had to do it in places like Australia and Brazil and South Africa and Poland and China. Not just do trials there, but also do them in obviously the United States. But maybe instead of concentrating in the key academic centers, you go to trial sites that have the patients, but don't necessarily have the same high costs or not as crowded as those premier academic centers. And so quite quickly, that model, that aspiration that he sort of identified, he realized that, you could at a bare minimum get a 30% cost advantage, a 30% time advantage, and a 30% quality advantage. But at the same time, you're building exposure with a bunch of folks that these are essentially going to become the first users of your medicine. And in some ways, by concentrating not on just academic centers, but going into non-traditional sites, you then all of a sudden are allowed to get a very different aperture of end user at the earliest points of development. So I think on the clinical trial side, that's one aspect of it. On the other aspect of it is on the discovery side. And our other co-founder is a very famous professor, Xiaodong Wang. Many people think of him as one of the fathers of apoptosis. In 1995, as a young assistant professor at Emory, he discovered the 5 key proteins that were involved in apoptosis. He was a student of 2 very famous professors at UT Southwestern, Goldstein and Brown, who won the 1985 prize for the cholesterol biosynthesis. Amazing academic lineage. And what was happening at that time was he was a very famous professor, youngest member of the National Academy of Science. He was a Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator, but he was given an opportunity to come back to China. And at the time, China was going through this renaissance in where they basically realized they wanted to be a leader in biopharma, very similar to the United States. They wanted to bring back their diaspora that in the 60s and 70s went west and give them a bunch of resources and really start to build innovation in China. And so John at the time met Xiaodong. They realized that in addition to this vision of expanding broad access to life-saving innovation, how do you start to then recreate that engine of discovery? And what I think they did is essentially what companies like Genentech and Chiron did in the late 70s and 80s, where you essentially took that innovation that was in academic or government labs and created an innovation model around it. And that's what gave rise to the early innovation of BeOne. But I think the key to it is, unlike a lot of companies, BeOne's DNA was truly anchored in building a global company. And that ability to transcend borders, whether it was our discovery engine or our clinical trial engine, is a very different model than other companies. And in my professional experience, Gilead, obviously the portfolio they had was accessed by global populations, but the focal point of that discovery very much was in the United States, and it cascaded out. BeOne was the opposite. They built the company from day one to truly be a global company operating in 5 continents. And so I think that's why that type of idea of company is very different, especially in the biopharma industry. And that's why we're so excited every day because I think, clearly the burden of cancer is is global, every country, every population, every family, and having that global perch to bring that innovation to patients is obviously a competitive advantage that we have.
And on one of the big pieces, and you and I have talked about this a lot, really centers around the concept of commercialization. BeOne is doing an incredible number of things, reinventing the model around bringing medicines to market. But one big key component about really stems from how these drugs get commercialized. A lot of your work stems around thinking about the future of that commercialization from the experience of both patient as well as HCP. We're in the most pivotal time. Everyone recognizes that at some point, definitely within our industry, that AI is taking a very pivotal role here. How do you see the convergence of all these different factors resulting in really commercial innovation at a company like BeOne that's going to be bringing a number of different products to market?
Well, I think it still today, and this I don't think has changed the model in the last 30 or 40 years in the industry, but it all starts with the molecule or the asset. And you still have to do incredible science and really do something that's differentiated and brings incredible value. And that, I think, is in our DNA, and it's in our industry's DNA. The industry, as you know better than anybody, is seeing more innovation, getting to more patients than ever before. But what I'm excited by, and I think this is really part of the crown jewel of what Ostro has pioneered, and obviously a lot of the value that you're now going to synergize with Viva, but this idea that the historical focus of our industry was really driving technology adoption to drive research and clinical development. But we were a little bit reticent to how do we embrace that technology for the end user, the patient, the healthcare provider, and how do we start to leverage technology to break down those educational barriers, those access barriers, those frictions, big or small. And I think what is incredibly exciting with the age of AI, and particularly the innovations that Ostro has championed over the last couple of years, is this idea of there's so much information out there. How do you make it even more accessible? And how do you go from having that static website where you have to spend hours to really find that information to now the clickless search and finding that information as fast as possible, but then creating the next actions to make it even more accessible. And, obviously in the context of the healthcare provider, and I really credit you and Ahmed in your founding vision, is it's not just enough to couple that information, but coupling it with discernible action that makes the healthcare provider's life even easier is the next generation. And I think all of the sort of foundational models that you guys have built, where you've essentially taken information and made it even more digestible, even more actionable to impact the patient, is the starting point. And you guys have pioneered that. But then thinking about the even additional modalities to make it even easier and tether other actions to access the medicine, mitigate issues with insurance, address education on affordability, all of those types of things. That's the next generation. And I think what we're also coming into line sight is all of that innovation that you have championed in making the healthcare provider and the practice of medicine even more efficient. That model is going to be the exemplar for the patient experience. And I think legitimately we're moving to a world role where we could legitimately see within 5 years an agentic agent that is answering questions bespoke to a patient, and it's essentially an accompaniment to each bottle or pill pack of medicine or injectable. And I think that's incredibly exciting because so much of that patient experience is oftentimes missed in the way that healthcare is administered today, where there's a latency between when you see your provider and the weeks that go by. Now, for the first time, we can start to get those insights on a sort of minute by minute basis. It, of course, I think augments and protects that fidelity between the doctor and the patient, but it also now gives us those sentinel signals where instead of waiting for a side effect to go from minor to serious, we're intervening even sooner and we're creating a wraparound system. So I think it's an incredibly exciting time. But it's not going to be easy. And I think what we can't forget is while everybody sort of romanticizes this idea that AIs are going to solve everything, and I know, Chase, you're a big champion of this, at the end of the day, having all of this information, there's still a responsibility to make sure that the information is as accurate as possible. And I think that's where building in these safeguards, starting to teach the literacy and the basic framework of how to use this information, how to use it responsibly, both from the patient and provider point of view. How do you create that commonality of intersection? That's where we're going to start to educate people on the next set of literacy. And it's going to be very analogous to when you and I were students, where half the battle of learning was learning how to access this information, how to think about the inherent biases that are in the information, and then how do you triangulate that information with other sources to hopefully arrive with the most holistic answer.
Anand, very well said. One of the things, and for those of you that don't know this, Anand and I will oftentimes do late night brainstorms. They've been on a brief pause for the last month as I recently welcomed a newborn into the world. But we've had some incredible brainstorms, and we have many more to come, and not just virtual remote brainstorms, but many in-person brainstorms to come. And I'm curious, your role is a very interesting, and it's an incredible role because it gives you exposure to so many of the leaders within all. It's not just about Ostro, right? This goes far beyond Ostro. Ostro is a piece in this, and there's so many other players in the space that you've taken the time to get to know, get to meet, to better understand the ecosystem as a whole. Holistically, I have to ask, now that with all the leading AI experts that you've met across all of these various different companies, and without getting into the details necessarily on on any individual company, is there anything that surprised you? Or is there anything that you've learned from a hypothesis perspective around how AI will change or impact commercialization? Is there anything that differs from that initial hypothesis you had, or any assumptions you had walking into those conversations with all these different ecosystem of players?
Well, I think in some ways, the ecosystem, at least in the context of these agents that healthcare providers and patients are using, the foundational ecosystem, I think, more or less is the same. They ingest information. It's now incumbent on the industry more than ever to create, tons of evidence to augment the product profile, but also to educate patients. And I think that sort of crescendo of data generation as well as crescendo of patient communications is something that I think is an inflection point in the industry. And in order to stay relevant in the age of AI, you have to constantly be generating information, both in that it helps give the end user, in this case, healthcare providers or patients, a much richer experience and a more informed experience, but it also keeps you relevant in the dialogue, and it keeps the information, the recency of that information. And that's incredibly exciting. And just understanding, I think, for the first time, at least from the patient side, in the past, there used to be a lot of information, but in the past, there was still an asymmetry. The information, for a large period of time was stuck in academic journals that nobody had access to. Then we moved to open access, but even with open access, it took a fairly, fairly high fluency, high literate person to understand that. I think what AI now has transcended is we now have the ability to take very complex information and simplify it and allow every single patient to be a CEO of their disease. And that's incredibly exciting. And I think that's something that I don't think I still realize the promise and potential of, but I think the use cases are bound. And I think clearly there's going to be a benefit. And I think clearly, by the way, that's going to be incumbent on our industry and academics and researchers to help document how these agents are improving outcomes, and allow that to help us iterate. On the physician side, what I think is incredible is, and this, Chase, from your training, there's just so much information. And even if you specialize in the industry, or you specialize in a particular discipline, we're getting to a point right now, and I think the last stat I saw is like every 30 days we double our information or something to that extent. But now having the ability to synthesize that information and essentially have an AI agent do that meta-analysis and systematic review and have a gold standard, that's a game changer as well. And what I'm incredibly excited by, and I know that you are as well, is this idea that the information asymmetry that's both existed within healthcare amongst healthcare providers, as well as the information asymmetry that's existed between the health system and patients, that's going to be disrupted. And obviously, in developed countries with accessibility to these tools, that's catalyzed, and we're seeing those changes today. And there's going to be a little bit of latency when it gets to the developing world. But that's going to be incredibly transformational in healthcare, because I think that has unfortunately been one of the biggest structural barriers in healthcare, quite frankly. But on the other side of it, the information quality, the ability to mitigate misinformation, the ability for these agents to amplify misinformation, that's the challenge. And I think we need to start thinking through that. And I think at least now with AI agents, unfortunately, negative information can reverberate and boomerang just as potently as good information. And sometimes the information sources, what would have previously been viewed as the gold standards in our industry, are under the same types of biases. And we don't need to go too far into that, but I think what I think the collective call to action is, all of us have to stay vigilant. All of us need to ensure that if patients and providers are going to use these wells of information, we all have to do a really good job to protect the public's trust, protect the public's public health, to keep these sources as pristine as possible. And so to me, that's the exciting piece. But that's also, I think, for the first time where truly that sort of consortium of partners, government, industry, small companies, big companies, technology companies, biotech, that's the excitement. And so I think what I'm also really excited by is just how innovation is going to be seeded in the future. I think we all know one of the hallmarks of innovation is the connection of disparate ideas, sometimes from other industries. And I think what's converging right now for the first time is that nexus between the biopharma industry and the tech industry. And that's quite exciting. And so I think from that perspective, I think there's going to be an incredible amount of opportunity. And really the trailblazers, I think, such as you and Ahmed, who've sort of sat in both worlds for a long time, healthcare and tech, are going to be the best custodians to take us forward on this future. And I'm excited about that because I think one of the biggest barriers, frankly, for the life sciences industry is we've missed that sort of cross-pollination up until more recently.
I have to do a quick fire round with you, Anand, just because I want to get this on the record to see how good you are at predicting potential trends. So this is more of a, we're going to do another episode in the next year. We'll do another one 2 years from now. And I'm going to keep asking these questions and we'll see how right you are and how wrong you are about your predictive capabilities. By the way, if you do very well here, I'm going to tell you, maybe there's definitely a future for you as well in playing some of the predictive markets as part of the AI rationalist communities. But my first question really centers around launch velocity. Will AI-driven market simulators make the traditional 18-month launch plan obsolete by 2030?
Absolutely.
Wow.
No doubt.
You were confident in that answer too, which I appreciate. Shifting a little bit more to hypersegmentation, because we've talked a lot about this concept of personalization. We've moved from mass market to specialty. Does AI enable a market of one, i.e., where every patient gets a custom tailored commercial experience?
I absolutely believe that. And in fact, I had a conversation with one of our board members about this. This idea that you would have 10,000 providers and you segment them into a 9-box. Mm-hmm. We know, just like the heterogeneity of our disease, the heterogeneity of 10,000 physicians is impossible to actually put them in that 9-box. So I totally agree. The idea that we're going to move to an N of one and we're really going to be communicating to the practice pattern of one physician in a particular ecosystem with a particular payer, I think that's absolutely where we're getting to. But what I also see is, if that's the brave new world and we're 5 to 10 years away from that, I think, the sort of shovel-ready solutions where everybody sits on a segmentation and the biggest quadrant is the unsegmented, the ability for AI to help us understand the unsegmented, I think is really, that's the thing that is going to be the shovel-ready insight that you're going to immediately see why the industry is going to change. I think the second point that I would make, though, is this idea that, how does a physician think? What is the intentionality in their word choice? How can we understand just from how they search what their perceptions are? Things like that, I think, is really, within our reach for the first time. And, going from a market research campaign that takes you 6 to 12 months to figure out your physicians, I think we're going to go just a single A/B testing where we take a Google-like or OpenAI ChatGPT-like construct and through the use of search, understand intention and background and how these medicines that we're going to launch into are going to solve that or the information that's required to allow them to scale. I think for the first time, we're going to have such precise understanding on that. So I think the opportunity is huge. But I also think, we're going to move to a world similar to what we were talking about with patients, where there's an accompanying AI agent that follows every bottle or every pill pack or every injector. I also think every physician is going to have an AI agent. And that AI agent, similar to how you have ChatGPT open on your personal computer and it's learning from you, is going to be the way how each one of these physicians ingests. And the way that my company and other companies are going to get into the system and help communicate the value proposition is just the bread and butter that's existed in our industry for a long time, which is evidence generation and really trying to generate as much evidence for as broad population as possible. And so what I'm excited about is we're probably going to spend a little less time marketing and a lot more time generating evidence that matters. And I think at the end of the day, since the ability to get into the physician's mindset via these agents is going to be much easier, we're going to just now be shifting that quotient from marketing dollars to really educational dollars. And marketing then takes on a slightly different form. It's going to shift from building the fidelity of the brand to now building the information to drive the brand.
Well said. We're gonna double click on those on some of those predictions on the next episode. One of the things that you brought up, which again is very interesting, right? It's I always like to think about it in terms of if we get back to like the basics of like a just your typical computer science class. You learn. We learn a lot about how the CPU manipulates bits. Storage will store bits, and network will move bits from point A to point B. And you and I have talked a lot about aspects of simulation theory, and we're not going to get into particle physics discussions on this call. Maybe that'll be on a future fun episode. But really, I almost view when we think about the analogous component of what I'm describing, the CPU is the discovery engine, i.e., just as a CPU manipulates bits to execute instructions, AI agents act as the logic layer for biology, right? Where they're not just storing, they're not just storing chemical formulas necessarily, but they're actually reasoning through those, right? I question whether or not you believe this to be a fair future. Instead of humans spending years in a wet lab testing if X then Y, the AI CPU simulates trillions of protein folding instructions per second, can manipulate biological bits, i.e., anything from genomic sequences, molecular structures, to solve the code of a disease before a pill is even pressed. When do we get to that future?
Oh, brave new world. I think it's funny. I've had that almost exact conversation with our president and head of R&D, Lai Wang, who's a student of Xiaodong Wang. And like any great scientist, he'll say it depends, and then he'll provide some context. I think if we're talking about antibodies, and if you herald back to your University of Pennsylvania course in biochemistry, it's a very sort of rational design. There's 20 amino acids. There's a primary structure. There's a secondary structure that dictates the folding between the alpha and beta helices. In protein engineering, what you've laid out, absolutely. We're going to know because the foundational knowledge is so self-evident, and there's been years and years of that. We're going to know, if I want to bind or neutralize an epitope, here's the antibody or binding sites that allow me to do it. Here's how I tether multiple antibodies to have bispecific or trispecific. Absolutely. But in other areas, and believe it or not, even though we've made such foundational discoveries in small molecules, it's still the infancy. We haven't discovered half the signal transduction pathways that are foundational to things like cell growth or cell death. Mm-hmm. And so that reality for a different modality could be very different, because we still quite fundamentally are just at the surface of our understanding. And so what I think it really tracks back to is there are going to be certain areas that are going to get catalyzed, and the energy of activation for innovation, it's going to be very clear. And the AI is going to be that enzyme, and we're going to get very, very fast discovery. And I think the antibody field in particular is going to be the best exemplar for that. But in other areas, such as small molecules and that signal transduction example, or anything involving neuroscience, or areas where we know that we've just tipped the surface and it's more complicated than protein-protein interaction, or genomic to phenotypic, or it's an interface between multiple factors and environment, and we still haven't really made those foundational discoveries. I'm not sure about AI. And so I guess if we're thinking about like the wet labs in Dallas, Texas, or where I live in San Francisco, is that going to change? And is AI just going to replace that? I don't think so yet, and I'm not sure for a while. But I think what's very clear is AI is going to be a very important tool to ingest lots of information, and that information is going to be very informative in the discovery process. And that's what keeps me excited. I mean, I think anybody that thinks the world is going to be completely change overnight with the age of AI, I'm not sure about. I think it's just going to be a little bit more mixed. I think the innovation is still going to require the human mind and 10,000 hours if you're a Malcolm Gladwell fan, but the AIs are going to augment that. And so we're going to have, I think, in many ways, a renaissance of innovation and a renaissance of discovery, but it's still going to be predicated on the hard work of understanding foundational and fundamental mechanisms in any discipline. And I think that actually gives me some great satisfaction, because the sort of pursuit of mankind trying to understand everything and anything cannot change, and I don't think it'll necessarily be replaced. It'll just be augmented. And I think in that way, certainly in the practice of medicine and the practice of research and discovery, we're going to see some great things in the next decade.
The last analogy that you got me thinking about, Anand, is the concept of just energy efficiency in terms of how the human mind works versus some of these models. Like, even when you look at the wattage gap, the fact that the brain runs on about 20 watts, which is again the power of a dim light bulb, actually. It's able to, our mind is able to filter out, and part of the reason that our brains work so efficiently is we're able to filter out 99% of the environmental noise, and really focus on whatever those most critical relevant variables are, right? Whereas AI, if you take you take autonomous driving as an example, whereas AI can pull thousands of watts, and is really not just focused on the velocity of a single moving object, but is looking at the clouds in the sky, is looking at the non-essential or non-critical variables, which makes the human mind, again, that much more efficient than so many of these models. The same goes on with latency versus precision, or data efficiency, the learning gap around how humans even leverage things like transfer learning, i.e., if we see a ball bounce in the street, we instinctively know a child might follow, whereas AI requires millions and millions of labeled frames to achieve that same reliability, because it's so data hungry and really struggles with some of the edge cases. So I'm with you. I think the human plays a very critical role in this future. We still have, I'm very excited. I'm obviously a huge AI advocate, but the human plays a very critical role, and that's not going away anytime soon. And if anything, these tools are meant to help us practice more at the top of our licenses as physicians, practice at the top of our licenses as leaders of great organizations, right? Like BeOne Medicines, in the case of your leadership and John's leadership. And again, I'm just excited to see when that future comes. But we will do a check. Just keep us accountable here, listeners. We're going to be doing a follow-up episode, and we will be pulling up the predictions that on that fire round, the question fire round, and we're going to pull up Anand's answers, and we're gonna determine how right he is, as we especially as we hit 2030 and beyond. But Anand, this is a lot of fun. I'm excited for the next one, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Chase. I have watched you obviously for a number of years. I will tell you now, I've crossed this off my bucket list. So I'm excited. And, I think I violently agree with what you just said. I think that's the thesis that needs to be advanced. That's the responsible thesis. And I think, I know you have a cute child in somewhere near you right now. And I think the world can see I've got some cute kids.
You do. You do.
Fundamentally, I think you nailed it. The human mind is still more efficient and foundationally always will be more efficient than any AI at whatever scale. And I think we just need to remember that thesis of it before we, sort of reimagine the entire world, because I think that really then clarifies what our role is going to be, particularly in healthcare, which is it's going to be a tool. It's going to help you make better decisions. It's going to be a shared decision-making tool in clinical medicine, but it's still not going to replace the element between physician and provider, physician and patient. And, I think that would be the great take-home point for our industry in general.
Well said. Well said. Well, Anand, thanks again, and I'll see you next time.
Thank you.